Okay, so you know how vintage is back in style? Like, really back in style.
Yeah, totally.
Well, get this, fur is making a comeback, too.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, and we're talking about vintage fur. Specifically, there was this New York Times article, really fascinating, and it dives into this whole trend.
A trend, huh? So, like, people are, like, wearing fur again.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, remember when fur was like the ultimate fashion no-no?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like, practically banished.
Right. And now it's like popping up everywhere.
Wow. That's a pretty big shift.
Huge shift. So we're going to try to figure out, like, how did this happen? Why is this happening? What does this even mean for the future of fashion? You know, the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm curious. It is kind of a head scratcher. I mean, like you said, a few years ago, fur was, like, totally taboo.
Totally.
And now it's, like, suddenly cool again.
I know, right? So this article, it talks about this like fur palooza happening at the Manhattan Vintage Show.
Okay, fur palooza. I like that.
Right. So picture these vendors like Igala NYC and Jenny Walker Archive. They're like mobbed. I mean, completely swarmed with shoppers.
Wow.
And a lot of them are already wearing fur. Like they came decked out in fur to buy more fur.
Wow, so it's like a whole scene.
It's a whole thing. And some of these pieces are selling for crazy money, like tens of thousands of dollars.
Seriously. That's well, that's pretty wild. So it's definitely not just about like thrifting for a bargain then.
No, no, it's like fur is like a status symbol again, but like a vintage status symbol.
It's interesting how those perceptions shift, right? I mean, the whole anti-fur movement was so successful for so long.
So successful. I mean, you think back to 1994, Calvin Klein, he was one of the first big designers to ban fur, right?
Yeah, big statement.
Big statement. And then like a domino effect, a Ralph Lauren, Gucci, Prada, Versace, even Fendi.
Fendi, really? They built their whole thing on fur.
I know, right? But even they, like, eventually went fur-free. By 2021, basically the whole industry had turned its back on new fur.
That's a pretty huge testament to like how much social norms can change and how effective those campaigns were.
Yeah, and groups like PETA, obviously, they played a huge role in that.
Totally.
But here's where it gets, like, really interesting. So the article points out this loophole. Okay, so new fur, still bad, like really frowned upon.
Makes sense.
But vintage fur, that's considered, like, more acceptable, even, like, sustainable,
Oh, interesting.
right? Because the argument is when you buy vintage, you're giving new life to something that already exists. You're not, like, contributing to new production.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like less waste and all that.
Right, exactly. Like, it's part of that whole conscious consumption, circular fashion, all that.
Right, right, right.
But then you think about it, and you're like, okay, is it really sustainable if you're spending, like, $30,000 on a vintage Gucci Fox fur chubby on First Dibs?
Ha ha. Yeah, that's a good point. It's like, where's the line?
Right. Like, how does that fit in with the whole ethical, affordable, sustainable idea?
I guess it depends on your definition of sustainable, right?
Right.
And I mean, let's be honest, sometimes those things get a little muddled when something becomes trendy and exclusive, like the price just goes up no matter what.
Yeah, true. It makes you wonder, like, what's the real motivation here? Is it about sustainability, or is it more about, like, the look or making some kind of statement?
Yeah, maybe a bit of both, or like not or the other, depending on the person.
Exactly. And speaking of making statements, we can't forget about celebrities, right? They're always a big part of these trends.
Oh, for sure.
The article mentions Rihanna wearing, like, a vintage John Galliano mink. And then you've got the Jenner sisters and Hailey Bieber. They were rocking furs and aspen.
Oh, yeah, they get photographed in everything, so that definitely has an impact.
Huge impact. I mean, when celebrities start wearing something, it kind of gives it this cool factor, especially for younger people who maybe don't have the same, like, baggage, I guess, associated with fur as older generations.
Yeah, that's true. They might not have those same negative associations.
Right, exactly. But, of course, this whole celebrity thing is also sparking some controversy, right?
Oh, of course. It's like throwing fuel on the fire. Like, is it okay to wear fur now?
Yeah, some people are like, yay, vintage, sustainable, and others are like, wait, hold on. This is not okay.
Yeah. So now it's like you've got this whole debate reignited.
Exactly. And it's interesting because it's kind of like multi-layered now, right?
Definitely. More to unpack than just the fur itself.
Right. So you've got celebrities kind of pressing the trend, and then you've got the sustainability arguments, and then, of course, you've got the ethical concerns. It's like a whole tangled mess.
It is. And it's kind of like vintage fur has become this Rorschach test almost for like how we view fashion and ethics and consumption and like just the world in general.
It really is. It's like this little microcosm of bigger conversations.
Absolutely. And it makes you think like, what are our values? What choices are we making? Like, It's a lot to think about.
I feel like this whole vintage fur thing, it's like tapping into something deeper.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's not just about the clothes, is it? It's like a whole, I don't know, a whole vibe.
Right. The article it even suggests this whole resurgence is maybe part of a bigger, like, cultural shift. Like people pushing back against, I don't know, political correctness or like what some see as like activism gone too far.
Oh, interesting. Like a counter movement kind of thing.
Yeah. And it makes me think about like all those TikTok trends, like mob wife, old money, rich girl.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those. It's like that whole glamorous, luxurious aesthetic.
Exactly. And fur like fits right into that, doesn't it? It's like those online trends are like influencing real world fashion choices.
That's so fascinating how that happens, right? Like social media, it both reflects like what's already happening and then kind of pushes it even further.
Totally. And speaking of pushing things further, like think about Ivana Trump.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Yeah, she was all about the fur coats, wasn't she?
Big time. And she was like a fashion icon back in the 80s and 90s, which, by the way, is having a bit of a moment right now. So,
Oh, totally. It all comes back around, doesn't it? Like fashion, music, everything. So maybe it's not so surprising, I guess, that fur is back too.
yeah, like it's that whole nostalgia thing. And maybe even like a little bit of rebellion mixed in. Like fur represents like pushing back against, I don't know, being told what to do, what to wear, all that.
Yeah, interesting. Like you can't tell me what to wear. I can see that.
Right. So we've got this like mix of things happening, social media, nostalgia, maybe some rebellion, all wrapped up in this vintage fur trend.
Yeah. But of course we can't forget about the ethical side of it all.
Oh, right. Yeah, definitely. We can't just gloss over that. So the article, it talks about PETA's perspective.
I'm guessing they're not exactly thrilled about this whole thing.
Not really. I mean, they're like obviously happy about how popular faux fur has become, but their argument is wearing any kind of fur, even vintage, it still kind of sends the message that like it's okay to use animal pelts for fashion.
Right? Like even if you're not directly supporting the industry that produced that specific coat, you're still kind of like normalizing the idea of fur.
Exactly. Like it desensitizes people to the whole issue.
Right. Like, oh, it's just a coat. It's vintage. No big deal.
And then the Humane Society, they also have concerns. They're worried that all this vintage fur, like being out there, it might actually encourage some people to go out and buy new fur.
Oh, that would be like totally counterproductive, wouldn't it? After all the progress they've made?
Totally. It's like one step forward, two steps back.
Yeah, like even if someone's buying a vintage coat with good intentions, thinking they're being sustainable and all that, they could actually be like inadvertently fueling the demand for new fur.
Exactly. It's crazy how these things like connect, right? Like one person's choice can have these bigger ripple effects.
Yeah, totally. It's all connected.
So where does that leave us? I mean, we've got this whole vintage fur thing, right? It's coming back for all these different reasons, sustainability, celebrity influence, maybe even a little bit of like cultural rebellion. But then we've got all these ethical concerns too.
It's messy, isn't it?
It is. It's like this big tangled web.
Yeah, and the article doesn't really like give us any easy answers. It's more like it just lays it all out there.
It's true. It's like, here's all the information, now you figure it out.
Exactly.
I mean, it's kind of amazing, right? Like a simple fur coat can spark all these like complicated conversations.
Yeah. And not so simple, right? I mean, fashion always kind of reflects like our values, what we believe in, how we see the world. But then when you bring in like ethics, animals, all that,
Yeah, it gets like a whole lot more
I
complicated.
hate it way more. And this article, it has this one quote that really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's from Anthony Barzilay-Fraun. He's the editorial director at First Dibs. And he said, vintage fur might be one of the few things still finding fans across the ideological spectrum.
Interesting. So like people who don't agree on much else can still agree on fur.
Right. It's like it goes beyond like left or right or whatever. Maybe it just taps into like a desire to be unique, Express yourself.
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe it's just like people wanting to do their own thing, not be told what to wear.
Right, exactly. Like a little bit of rebellion.
Yeah. Yeah. But then like it could also be about tradition too, right? Like depending on who you ask.
Oh, totally. It's like this weird mix of like old and new, rebellious and traditional, all at the same time.
I know. It's crazy. But okay, so what about the bigger picture? What does this mean for, the fur industry? Like all this vintage fur, could it actually lead to more new fur?
That's the big question, isn't it? Like, if vintage is okay, does that mean new fur will be next?
Right. Like we're kind of at this crossroads, right? We're more aware of like sustainability, animal welfare, all that.
Absolutely. But then there's this whole vintage craze happening.
And this like fascination with the past.
Yeah, and social media too. Don't forget about that. Like if TikTok keeps showing like those glamorous fur looks, that's going to influence people.
Oh, for sure. Especially young people. So I guess where does that leave us? I mean, this has been a lot to like digest.
It has. It really makes you think.
Right. Like is vintage fur just a trend? Or is it something bigger? And will it like help create a more ethical fashion industry or will it just lead back to the old ways? I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough to say. It's like we've uncovered all these different threads, but like how they all weave together, it's still kind of a mystery.
Totally. But I think like the important thing is to just like keep thinking about it, keep asking questions.
Absolutely. Be aware of like what's influencing your choices, where things come from, who made them, all that.
Exactly. And maybe even like do a little research yourself, dive a little deeper. There's always more to learn.
Always.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap things up for today. But this conversation, it doesn't have to end here. It's like always evolving, right? Along with everything else.
Totally.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.